Bay Area brawler Skylar Greenberg, and your Colonial Champion Sean McCoy. Welcome to the Court Martial Podcast!
Hello, everyone, again, and welcome to the Court Martial Podcast, the podcast made by wrestling fans for wrestling fans. I am your Colonial Champion here today with a special edition. Just flying solo today, but something came up that I feel like I wanted to address, and because Skylar lives on the West Coast and I'm recording this at about 5 in the morning at his time, and Josh again, I'm sure, is busy delivering pizzas day and night as our perennial Spider-Man that he is, I thought I would sit here and just have a little fireside chat, if you will, with you, the fans of the Court Martial Podcast. And what I want to talk about today, my stepdad gets a copy of the New Yorker every couple of weeks. Maybe every week. I'm not sure what it's all about, how long they print. I don't get the copy. But I got it from the mail the other day, and I'm walking down my road, and I flip, just open to a random page. And it turns out that I've turned to an article, and if you want to actually pay for the subscription to this channel, you can. I don't recommend it when it comes to the New Yorker. I got an article called American Attitude by Vincent Cunningham, and it's meant to talk about the Mr. McMahon docuseries, the kind of profile and biopic of the life that was Vince's, and how it pertains to our modern political structure and where our mentalities are heading into this November 5th election. And before I go any further, I'm going to throw out a disclaimer here that nothing that I say in this podcast is meant to determine or reveal or reflect my political affiliations. I take great pride in not having that be a part of my discourse when it comes to my podcasting career, when it comes to CIW or anything we do. If fun little tidbits and jokes leak out, that's one thing, but I'm not somebody who's going to sit out here and say, this is my political beliefs and this is what you should subscribe to. And the reason I even bring that up is that it's going to sound somewhat like I am making this point as an indictment on the New Yorker based on who they have really enjoyed targeting for the past 8 years. And that's not the case. I'm not trying to just bash the New Yorker. There's an overall point I want to make about this that I'm going to use Mr. Vincent Cunningham's article to demonstrate here. But I want to read an excerpt of this out of this actual piece right here. And I want to just put this into perspective as to why I even felt this was worth talking about. So this is about a paragraph in, thereabouts, and this is what he says. This is about the Mr. McMahon Netflix series that he watched and things like that. And I'm going to stop it here. I'm only going to read one paragraph. And I quote, "The series advertises itself as a close look at a big figure, McMahon, in all his muscular strangeness. And indeed, in a potted way, we learn some biographical facts. McMahon's father, Vince Sr., was also a honcho in the world of pro wrestling before this particularly American form of lowbrow quote-unquote sports entertainment went national." I'm going to stop right there. The only person who calls wrestling lowbrow is someone who is in complete and absolute ignorance of the sport. And this is my big problem. This is my Jim Cornette going off on Phil Mushnick thing about that. I've heard a lot of people call wrestling fake, right? That's the one taboo word that wrestling fans, like real wrestling fans, really do. At least I do take some level of offense to. It used to be fighting words. Now people like Matt Bourne got laughed at for having that kind of mentality, and I really feel bad for people like that who were trying to keep that semblance of the boys have to take this like it's real if nobody else does. And now once all of the marks got into the back, and now everybody in the back thinks it's fake, and then they got a money mark in Tony Khan who is willingly basically condoning that philosophy, that's what you end up with. So, but here's my problem. I don't have as much of a problem with the word fake. Because at the end of the day, the outcome of predetermination then gives an argument behind that. Even though physically speaking, that couldn't be further from the truth. But the word that I have more of an issue with is lowbrow. Because the only people who use lowbrow to describe wrestling have never watched a single minute of good quality professional wrestling in their lifetime. Guaranteed. This dude is probably sitting in front of a fireplace on a lounge chair, sipping a Bellini, going, "Ugh, those pathetic cretins there, rooted in the professional wrestling sports entertainment. We obviously would not engage in such debauchery," with their nose as far up their own ass as they possibly could be, as the case was here with Mr. Cunningham. Because the truth is, there's a lot of very intellectually captivating things that happen in the world of pro wrestling when it's done correctly. I'm not saying that Vince McMahon's potty humor was the means to that end. But if you look at the match psychologically, a perfect example is what happened between CM Punk and Drew McIntyre over the course of a calendar year. Because it wasn't just about getting in the ring and fighting and making each other bleed, or as this guy will go on to say, hitting somebody with a chair, but you'd have to go to Louisiana to see it because he has a terrible grasp of what the territories were. Does this Mr. Cunningham. And this is why I'm not recommending anybody pay the subscription to read this article, because you're just going to get pissed off by it like I was. Because the truth is, there's nothing lowbrow about what CM Punk and Drew McIntyre did. It was rooted in family, it was rooted in values, it was rooted in friendship, and what you had taken from me and what you would potentially here to do and destroy. There was a lot of layers to that feud that were far beyond, oh, well, the socio-political economic stature of the nomenclature surrounding the, shut the fuck up, right? That honestly, the truth is, with what they did, there was layers of how they presented themselves, the kind of intent they were going to do, whether the people believed them, and look at that Hell in a Cell match. It wasn't just brutality. There was meaning behind it. There was direction behind it. Their body language told the story. There's so much subtlety in professional wrestling that all of these quote-unquote intellectuals who deem it as lowbrow maybe just aren't smart enough to grasp those subtleties. And I truly think that wrestling gets half of its bad reputation from journalists like that, who will do everything they can to write a predisposed hatred article because they don't have any interest or desire to learn what professional wrestling, when done correctly and adequately, where it was outdrawing the NFL for many, many, many years until they finally got their shit together, did the NFL, and brought it to new heights. There was more money in wrestling than there was the NFL, the actual quote-unquote sport. But this, I'm not expecting this guy to know any of that, right? This guy works for the New Yorker, okay? It comes with a dildo on the chair, so you can be as tightwad as you possibly can about everything you're writing. And I'm going to continue this same paragraph, and you're going to see what I mean. His World Wrestling Federation, and I quote, his World Wrestling Federation promotion was confined to the Northeast, part of a loose patchwork of territories, kept within boundaries by a non-interventionalist code of honor. If you lived in Louisiana and wanted to see a metal chair smashed over the head of a dizzy athlete, you do it at a local event organized by a company headquartered close to home. Well, first of all, that is the worst description of the territories you could possibly ask for. Non-interventionalist isn't even true, because when somebody was about to leave for dates, there'd be contact. Hey, Vince Sr., I got Junkyard Dog. He's too fat and he's too coked up, but he's still got star power. You want him? Sure, bring him, although that was Vince Jr. at the time. Sure, bring him up. We'll have a couple dates. And maybe that's a bad example. But that used to happen all that. There was a healthy communication. A better example, Jerry Jarrett and Bill Watts. And what a disgrace to Bill Watts to say the only reason to go watch wrestling in Louisiana was to see somebody have a chair smashed over his head, when that was not what was happening in Mid-South at all, not without purpose. And again, but these people don't want to see those kinds of subtleties. They would much rather blanket statement to demonize the guy who nationalized it so they can make a bigger point about their political enemy that the New Yorker has established themselves rooted in. Take a guess who that might be. One of our former presidents. And the fact is, this guy, he goes on to say a whole bunch of other goo-ga, and I'm going to read one last paragraph that I think really kind of demonstrates where this guy's mindset is when it comes to, and I'm going to make an overall better point about journalism here in a second, because there are some parts of this that try to draw parallels and decent parallels back and forth. That does happen pretty frequently, as far as, is the political atmosphere a work versus the wrestling atmosphere work. And I have long said that professional wrestling has really made me understand politics a lot better. Ask Glenn Jacobs, he's basically said the same point. Because it at least gives you the idea of how people get popular and why. If not, it's a work, which I'm not going to say one way or another. Because again, I'm not going to reveal my own personal feelings and affiliations behind that point, because that's not the point. The point is, this guy wanted to extrapolate from Mr. McMahon what he could deem the parallel between that docuseries and the political sphere as a whole, and how desensitized we are to major events. And he does a decent job of doing that, but this is where he loses all his credit for me. This is the last paragraph. And again, and I quote, "The most popular period of WWE's history came in the late 90s and early 2000s during what's called the Attitude Era. The matches were no longer between good guys and bad guys, but between bad guys and worse guys." Not true. Goes to show he never watched any of it. Although, I will concede the point about the NWO, because that was the cool heel era. So it's not between bad guys and worse guys. It's between bad guys that people liked and good guys that people didn't really care for as much anymore. And that's more of a byproduct of the fans at that time rather than what the wrestling was presenting, which again, you don't get that sort of nuance when you are going into an article trying to bash the entire sport as a whole and having the catalyst means to do so with a docuseries like this, which real wrestling fans knew there was nothing new that came out of that we didn't already know. Hold that thought, I'm going to get back to it in a second. Coming back to this article, and I quote, "The first big hero of the moment was the beer-swilling, leather-wearing, foul-mouthed Stone Cold Steve Austin, who appropriated a famous Bible verse for his own purposes. Here's John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Here's Austin 3:16, intoned by middle schoolers of my generation with devotional glee. I just whipped your ass." This dude was getting shoved into lockers in middle school. I guarantee it. This guy is channeling his middle school trauma and blaming it on professional wrestling. That's my biggest issue with all of these idiots who come in with these big name columns and these big name articles, New York Post, New York Times, Washington Gazette, the Fuck My Ass Daily, whatever it is. And they come in here and they write these articles trying to bash a profession that I've come to know and love for the better part of 30 out of the 31 years of my life, without even realizing that there is so much more intricacies to that business than just a face value perception based on your own trauma and what you witness in a docuseries that doesn't even tell half of the story. And I'm really tired of people like the Vincent Cunninghams and the Phil Mushnicks trying to destroy the reputation of wrestling with no basis for it. If you're going to destroy wrestling's reputation, go watch All Elite Wrestling and have actual evidence to it. Not this, oh, well, I was bullied as a kid, so therefore it's Vince's fault, and therefore it's Donald Trump's fault. It's just absurd to me. It is absurd to me that people who have this predisposed bias towards wrestling are allowed to rake op-ed articles about it. And the problem is, and this is where my bigger issue is, what we need are objective wrestling journalists who are, if they're going to write an op-ed like this, at least have some basis to give some concession to why Stone Cold was popular and to why that anti-authority figure, where he became the ultimate foil for the demonic, overlording, I run the country boss like Vince McMahon, the regular guy in Stone Cold Steve Austin willing to put up a fight about it. No wonder establishment guys like Vincent Cunningham working for establishment newspapers like the New Yorker are intimidated and want to devalue people like Stone Cold Steve Austin. Whether you agree at his work or not, the emphasis of what that whole era was, you have just diminished because you can't get over the fact that somebody stole your lunch money and shoved you in a locker while you were wearing crappy glasses and probably dripping nose drippings out of your face onto your peach fuzz. And I'm sick of these guys, like the Phil Mushnicks and Vincent Cunninghams of the world, taking the piss out of my business without even trying to understand why these things are popular and why they were so successful and why Stone Cold Steve Austin was the biggest drawing wrestler of all time. Wrestling was getting 6 million people for just WWF when Steve Austin was on top. Not trying to diminish The Rock. He's just as much of it. that same charismatic thing. Do you think The Rock is a bad dude? Now, here in 2024, we have a different story, but for the whole reason why The Rock was there in the first place when he got over, think about all the stuff The Rock was saying. And you're going to sit here and tell me because he didn't write a 4-length dissertation on the intricacies and geopolitical ramifications of Infinite Jest that somehow that is less culturally relevant and less actually intellectually satisfying? Because yeah, Austin wasn't the most polished human being on earth, but I guarantee you if that dude wore a suit and tie and started sucking up to Vince, that the whole business would implode. Oh, that's what happened. Okay, so actually turning into a more refined establishment guy actually hurt the business. Funny that. And it's almost like Vince had an ear on the sounds of the culture at the time, which he would long lose after he had definitively won the Monday Night Wars. But at the same point, you can knock Vince all you want for things that he very much definitely deserves to be knocked for. But you can't deny the ear to the pulsing. And then there's another thing. In that first bit, he says, in a primarily American lowbrow sports entertainment, which I'm going to call complete bullshit on that because that's diminishing years and years and years and years and years of wrestling with Japan. It diminishes years and years and years and years of wrestling with Great Britain. This is a guy who knows nothing about pro wrestling and actually learned less watching the McMahon documentary. And this is why those documentaries just, I don't want to see those printed. I don't want to see those put out because the truth is you get morons like this who then think that they're going to use their big New Yorker brain to make some sort of damning article about what the political discourse is, using this guy and this industry as a scapegoat that he has no knowledge about. And I'm not one to sit, as somebody who is a prime example of one a lot of the time, I don't have time for published pontificators. And that brings me to the second part of this. Because at the same point that we need less people like the Vincent Cunninghams of the world, we also need less people like Dave Meltzer. Because Dave Meltzer is the opposite side of that wrestling journalism coin. People who are so sucked into the bubble, people who are so in the wrestling business and wrestling industry that they have no broad stroke concept of reality. And so you get this group of guys who are making articles and publishing op-ed posts about wrestling who are so into wrestling that they're leaving everybody else behind and giving nobody context. And then as a result, then you get people like Dave Meltzer who are actively lying to better fluff their position and to better fluff a company that really does deserve the kind of criticism that Vincent Cunningham was giving the wrestling industry. And you get the complete opposite side of that coin. And you get people so on the other side of the fence that they can't even understand why people like Vincent Cunningham have the opinions they do. And so we don't get this objectiveness that we need to say it's not the profession's fault that it has this reputation. It's not wrestling's fault that people like Vince McMahon bastardized a lot of what made wrestling special. It's not the industry's fault that Tony Khan bought his way into making fools out of everyone who's ever stepped foot in the wrestling business. It's not the industry's fault that it made more money than the actual sports that they all fawn over, and they don't like that because it's something that doesn't necessarily apply to their guidelines of what's moral and just and correct, because it's a little cruder at face value. And that's my point. It's at face value that wrestling is crude. But if you get the real good stuff, if this dude had watched any territory wrestling at all, he would have known there is so much more to it than that. And I'm just bothered by this. I'm bothered by the fact that we don't have people who can actually report wrestling accurately while giving greater context of the subtleties of the sport to the public at large, which is why I like what Stevie Richards does. And he goes in or used to, and just break down all these matches. Now he's just doing Gossip Girl shit, which is what his host loves to do. He does it with Dutch and he does it with Stevie. I don't understand why, but prior to, he would break down the concepts of the match. Here's the subtleties. Here's this. This is what this body language means. This is what went wrong in this. You know, he was able to break all of that down. And I just think that the amount of people who deem wrestling as lowbrow are actually some of the most uneducated people regarding the sport. And that is something that bothers me, and I don't know the true solution to it. Because what we really need is a broad stroke educational class saying, look, this is no different than any theater or any opera you watch. It's just that the people involved are wearing a lot less clothing and doing a lot more damage to their bodies. And then that's the other thing. When things go wrong in the wrestling industry, you get nunnicks like Nancy Grace going, oh, well, steroids are clearly the problem, and these guys are... And they go and talk about wrestling like they've watched it for the past 50 years. When the reality is, they just like having something to beat up on. They just like having that bottom of the totem pole thing that they can kick. And let me ask you this. All of these people who are in this highbrow circle because their eyebrows are so high that they've gone all the way around to the back and now they've got hairy ass cheeks because they raised their eyebrows so high thinking that they're so much holier than thou than the wrestling industry. But let me ask you this. Is part of the reason that they view wrestling as lowbrow because it does such good work with developmentally disabled children and adults? Is it the fact that they go to the Special Olympics every year and they work with special needs kids all the time and they bring such joy and they've done more Make-A-Wish than any other profession on earth? So is their perception of wrestling being lowbrow a direct result of their own ignorance and their own judgmentality and their own discrimination against people who are intellectually maybe not at the level that they think they are? And I'm here to tell you two things, Vincent Cunningham. You are not nearly as smart as you think you are. You are not nearly as versed in what professional wrestling is and is about than you think you are. And I'll tell you this, a lot of the developmentally disabled and special needs kids that I meet at these wrestling shows are a lot smarter and have a lot more perception about the world than you ever will. So I want to make sure that these people understand that you are not doing the world a favor by telling people to change the channel. You're not doing wrestling fans the favor of telling people that this isn't worth your time. And perhaps maybe if you actually sat down and gave a fuck about what you were writing, media would not be as decried, media would not be as delegitimized, and media would be taken a lot more seriously than it is now. But until people like this leave the actual journalism sphere, until people like this and articles like this are wiped from the public discourse, the wrestling industry is always going to have to fight a reputation that it is partially earned. Not fully, but partially earned. But I will never concede to an article like this being good when they put words like lowbrow in it and making Steve Austin, because he switched a Bible verse to actually captivate people, most of which are Christians, by the way, and a whole lot of them didn't really give a damn that Austin did it. Let's just put it that way. All of these people who want to try and extrapolate political meaning out of pro wrestling ought to do themselves a favor and actually fucking watch it. Because I promise you, you're going to have a lot more meaning and substance to say than you do now. So with a sincerity that I very, very seldomly share to many people, I say to Vincent Cunningham and to Phil Mushnick and to all those wrestling journalists predisposed to try and bring down an industry they know nothing about, go fuck yourself. We'll see you next time.